Well, thank you all very much. It is always a pleasure to be back on stage before the greatest intellectual critical mass in New York, and a particular pleasure to be here this evening on midterm election night, where all of you clearly wanted to do something to keep your mind off what the results might be. But it is a huge honor and a personal pleasure to be on stage with Andrew Roberts. He truly is one of the world's greatest and most prolific biographers, and we are here to discuss, indeed, Churchill, and if you do it this way, you can see how prodigious it is. Churchill walking with destiny. Andrew, in fact, your output has been nearly as prodigious as that of the man about whom you write. So I congratulate you on another book that's cracked the top 10 on the UK nonfiction list, one that has been described by the Sunday Times reviewer as undoubtedly the best single-volume life of Churchill ever written. Not bad, that. By the Daily Telegraph as the best single-volume life imaginable of a man whose life would seem technically impossible to get into a single volume, although it did take 1,100 pages to do it. And that led to it being described as a beast that is virile and mobile. I particularly enjoyed the review by Member of Parliament Michael Gove, who described your biography as brilliant, breathtaking, and unput-downable, and observed that all Robert's past life has been but a preparation for this hour and this work, and this brilliant book is a fitting crown to his career. Although, yeah, not bad. I mean, this is... Finally, John Campbell, author of The Finest Hour, writes, "It is what I would call a heroic biography, appropriately matched to the ambitious egotism and undoubted achievement of the life it describes. It will surely remain the outstanding Churchill biography for many years to come." So again, that is good stuff. And with that, let's begin. As Susan mentioned, you've written about Napoleon, brilliantly again, I might add. That was his last book. Wellington, history of the English-speaking people, various military commanders, battles, Hitler, Lord Halifax, among others, 20 in total. How did you happen to choose Churchill?
Up until about the age of 5, I was under the impression that my grandfather was Churchill. It must have come as a terrible shock when I discovered that this very fat man who smoked cigars actually had nothing to do with Winston Churchill at all. But
for how many years were you depressed?
No, exactly, yes. But he was an ever-present feature in the life of a child who was 18 months old when he died, when Churchill died. So when I was growing up, he was always there. He was considered the great hero of English children of my generation, and so I suppose in the back of my mind, he's never been absent, really.
Why the subtitle, Walking with Destiny?
Oh, because it's completely key to understanding Churchill. He had this extraordinary sense of his own personal destiny. He believed from the age of 16, when he was a schoolboy at Harrow. Churchill was almost entirely self-educated because he had to be, because he went to Harrow. He believed that, and he told his friend, that there will be great struggles, great upheavals, and that I shall be called upon to save London, save the country, and save the empire. And he believed that.
How old was he when he...
He was 16 years old when he said that.
Modest ambition.
Absolutely, and then exactly half a century later, he fulfilled that ambition to the title. And so this sense of destiny, of him being specially looked after, he spoke about the invisible wings that flapped above him when he had many close brushes with death, meant that he felt that he was being specially saved in order to save London, the country, and the empire. So
there have been at least 1,000 biographies of
1,009.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
The first, I think, was when he was still a young man.
Yes, he was only 30. The first one came out in 1905 when he was only 30 years old, which shows how much people must have been looking at him from the very early part of his career.
And then many, many hundreds since his death. So what in the world made you think that you could bring anything new to readers, and why now? I mean, noting that all your accomplishments and so forth, but this is a field that has been very thoroughly tilled.
Very thoroughly. When Pug Ismay, Churchill's chief of staff, was writing his autobiography, he told President Eisenhower that he didn't think that a fully comprehensive life of Churchill could be written until 1960. He was writing it in 1960. He said that it couldn't be written until 2010. And I agree with him, because in the last decade there have been a cornucopia of new sources that have come out about Winston Churchill. The Queen allowed me to be the first Churchill biographer to use her father's diaries. And King George VI met Churchill every Tuesday of the Second World War, and they served themselves from the sideboard so that they could be completely alone, because the King Churchill trusted the King with all of the great secrets of the Second World War. The nuclear secrets, the Enigma decrypting, where they were going to attack and the grand strategy, who he was going to hire and fire. And it wasn't natural that they were going to get on, because during the abdication crisis, Churchill, of course, had supported the King's elder brother, Edward VIII, and also the King had been a great supporter of Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement. But certainly by the time of the fall of France and the Battle of Britain, and definitely by the Blitz, they were friends. In fact, the King uses the word friends in his diary, and he was the only one of the the King's four prime ministers, to be referred to by his first name. And so we have these diaries, and the King would write down everything that Churchill had said at the lunch. So this is a brand new and completely fabulous new source. Lots of aperçus, lots of hopes and fears, a few gags, and we know now what was going through Churchill's mind every Tuesday. Then we have 41 sets of papers that have been deposited at Churchill College Archives in Cambridge since the last major biography of him, including Mary Soames, Churchill's daughter's 1940 diary, which is a tremendously moving document. We have the Ivan Maisky diaries, the diaries of the Soviet ambassador from 1932 to 43. We've got the verbatim accounts of the war cabinet, which were only discovered in the last 10 years. And also we have Pamela Harriman's love letters. And she had a very active romantic life during the Second World War. And we can learn a lot.
And after, as I recall, as well.
Yes, absolutely. But during the war, when she was married to Winston Churchill's son Randolph, she had and had a baby by him. She had affairs with Avril Harriman, who she later married, FDR's envoy, but also Ed Murrow, the great journalist, Bill Paley of CBS.
Oh my goodness.
Jock Whitney.
Started all the way back then.
Absolutely. And some absolutely fascinating people, including the head of the RAF, Sir Charles Portal. And so it's been tremendously helpful to have all of these letters, because there's one point at the Yalta conference when where there were 3 people who were writing love letters to her all at the same time.
Presumably not knowing about the other?
No, none of them knew about the others, no, absolutely.
So what did these new sources tell us that we didn't know before?
Oh, well, they tell us what an extraordinarily emotional man, he was a man driven entirely by his passions, Winston Churchill. He burst into tears 50 times during the Second World War. Must have been extremely off-putting to have been an MP suddenly, to have the Prime Minister crying on the front bench there. He had this extraordinary sense of he wasn't the buttoned-up Victorian aristocrat at all, the stiff upper lip Victorian aristocrat of the age and the class and the background he was born into. He was, in fact, a throwback to an earlier era. He was a romantic Regency figure who wore his emotions on his sleeve.
It's interesting, actually. And of course, these are public bursting into tears. You can only imagine what was going on behind the scenes. I mean, in all honesty.
Well, he was in tears quite a lot behind the scenes as well.
We used to have a saying that, don't let your shoulders slump, don't let the troops see you down. So we'd generally wait to close the door until we did that. Very interesting. Look, you're well known as somebody who travels extensively while you're researching and writing. Again, quite prodigious in that regard. So I'm just sort of curious where your travels took you as you conducted research on this individual who fought on battlefields in many different continents and traveled the world in many other persona even before becoming the Prime Minister.
Yes, well, we were, this time, in my previous book on the Second World War, I dragged my poor wife to places like Stalingrad and a Japanese extermination camp and Auschwitz and various places like that. And she said, with this book, can we go somewhere sunny? So we went actually to Cuba, to the middle of the jungle in the center of Cuba, which is where Churchill heard his first shot fired in anger, which was a fascinating trip. We went to Gallipoli, of course, to see the battlefields of the Dardanelles, which were so important to Churchill's career.
It nearly ended it.
It very nearly ended it. In any other age, it probably would have ended it. We went to where Churchill crossed the Rhine, and of course all around England. And yes, it's one of the fun things. It wasn't like the Napoleon book where I visited 53 of Napoleon's 60 battlefields, because most of the archive stuff is at Churchill College, Cambridge, and that's where I spent most of the time.
Did you retrace any of the battlefields of?
Yes, I went to Plurgstert, the place where he was battalion commander of the 6th Battalion of the Royal Scots Fusiliers.
I mean, you might just diverge for a moment and just note that, of course, he had been, what was it, the Lord of the Admiralty or whatever?
Yes,
so
First Lord of the
Secretary of the Navy, if you will. And that's when we had Gallipoli. It was such a disaster. He resigned, and then he
didn't have to go to the trenches. He was 40 years old. They weren't calling out people who were 40 at that stage of the war. But he, almost as a redemptive thing, decided that he wanted to share the dangers that he'd sent men into, of course. And so he went to the front line, and he didn't need to either go out 30 times into no man's land.
Yes.
Lieutenant colonels could have stayed back at battalion headquarters without any stain on their honour, but he went 30 times. He got so close to the German trenches, he could hear the Germans speaking.
I think he really was, I don't know if he was an adrenaline junkie or a thrill seeker or just...
No, I don't think
because
he was
he had already, he was in the charge at Omdurman, wasn't
yes,
the final great cavalry charge.
The last great cavalry charge of the British Empire, exactly, in September 1898. And where he killed 4 dervishes, and their unit suffered 25% casualties.
Gosh.
And the following year, when he was in South Africa, when his train was ambushed, they suffered 34% casualties. And then, of course, about 2 months later, he escaped from prison in Pretoria and crossed 300 miles of enemy-occupied territory. So he risked his life constantly, but I don't think it was because he was an attention junkie. I just think he was a tremendously brave man.
And this is after starting his career in what we would now call Pakistan, or maybe the edge of Afghanistan, the
Yes, not far away from where you yourself have served with such distinction. It's the Swat Valley, the Mahmud Valley. He was up there with the Malakand Field Force. He was at Peshawar for quite a long time. And that was where he came up close, very close, as he did obviously also at Omdurman, to fundamental fanaticism. And that's one of the reasons that he was able to spot it in the Nazis. He could see in Hitler and the Nazis the kind of complete fanaticism that he had seen himself in his military career, but which the other prime ministers of the 1930s, people like Ramsay MacDonald and Stanley Baldwin and Neville Chamberlain, had never come across that in their lives.
Well, let's rewind, having taken that little excursion, and just refresh our memories on where he was born, his upbringing, and so forth. Well, that has a big influence.
A big influence, yes. He was an aristocrat. His grandfather was the Duke of Marlborough. He was born in the palace, the greatest palace in England. Blenheim Palace, which even the royals are envious of Blenheim Palace, and rightly so.
They rent it out for dinners now, by the way, in case anybody wants. I've been to one of those. It's really worth it.
No, it is.
If you can find someone to do it.
Wonderful place, yeah. And so But the drawback was that although he had all the grandeur of the Marlborough name and the Spencer Churchill name, they had no money at all, because the father, a disdainful, aloof, mercurial, brilliant politician, was constantly broke, because he and his wife, Churchill's mother, spent so much.
And talk a little bit about them, because they're pretty important in his eventual psychological makeup. Yes.
The father completely failed to spot any brilliance in Churchill, and actually some of the most moving letters in this book are these harsh letters from the father, and Winston's pleading for love and affection, and also for pleading for attention from his mother, who took the whole Victoria, even though she was American, came from Brooklyn, was born in Brooklyn, she nonetheless took the Victorian thing about children being seen and not heard to a terrible degree. There's one point in the first 6 months of 1884 when she only saw her children, Winston and Jack, for 6 hours in those 6 months. And so he grew up hoping for and wanting love and affection, and simply not getting it, except from his nanny, Elizabeth Everest, who he did get a lot from and who he adored.
Now, he's extraordinarily prolific, as I mentioned earlier. Didn't quite get
That's because he was broke all the time.
Is that what it was?
Yes, there were 37 books.
Always writing.
Always writing, because he had 14 servants in the 1940s and was pretty much in the red almost all his life. He didn't actually get into the black until he was 71 years old and signed the contract for his war memoirs. Otherwise, he had to put Chartwell up for sale twice. His beautiful manor house in Kent. Well, they pulled it back from the estate agents the day before the particulars were about to go out. He gambled enormously, both on the tables, but also at Monaco. But also, oh yeah, huge gambler, and also a terrible stock market speculator. He would sometimes buy and sell in a 3-day period. There's one stock he bought and sold 14 times. And he never made money.
The precursor of high-frequency trading. Gosh, those are actually new to me. I had no idea.
Well, I was very lucky. I was very lucky to find to be shown by his grandson his stock market trading books from Vickers da Costa, his stockbrokers. So yes, that's another new aspect that's in this book.
Now, along with the incredible productivity comes incredible eloquence and inspiration and oration and all the rest of that, which, again, is somewhat mind-boggling. I mean, I can see cranking out lots of works, but these were incredibly polished and again, inspirational, carefully researched and so forth. I mean, one of his, quote, books was actually 6 volumes. Where did this eloquence come from?
Well, actually, his oratorical eloquence came from theory rather than practice, fascinatingly. When he was 21, he wrote an article called The Scaffolding of Rhetoric. And in this article, he set out the 5 things that you need to do in order to get an audience on your side. And at that point, and when you look later at the speeches that he gave later, he stuck to the 5 principles. And
do you recall what they were?
They're all in chapter 2.
Okay, pull it out.
And
I could use those here at the 92nd
absolutely,
Street
yeah, no, absolutely. Check it out in chapter 2, David, and you'll wow the crowds. The extraordinary thing about this is that at the age of 23, he hadn't given a public speech in his life. So he did it from theory. Then he, of course, followed that up with the most extraordinary amount of practice. He was so prolific. He accepted invitations to speak whenever and wherever it was. So he was constantly on the train, going all over the country, traveling tens of thousands of miles to give speeches. And by the time he became Prime Minister, he had given thousands several thousand speeches. And of course that was an exact explanation of what he talked about later about the being but a preparation for this hour and for this trial. It's very interesting what during the Second World War about how he would craft his great rousing speeches of the Second World War. And you remember that magnificent peroration which starts, which is at the end of one of his speeches of June 1940, which starts, "We shall fight on the beaches," and goes on with talking about how we shall fight with growing confidence in the air, and it ends, "We shall never surrender." That speech, he later pointed out to his private secretary, he liked old words, old English words, short words, clarity, and short sentences. And that little 141 word paragraph, all of those words, except for two, are from the Old English. Those two being confidence, which comes from the Latin, and surrender, which comes from the French.
Quite extraordinary. Only a British citizen would recall that latter fact. I can attest that the old enmities are still very alive and not far below the surface. You know, as you think about his money problems, what a shame that he didn't have the American public speaking enterprise that we now have. You know, the Washington Speakers Bureau, the highest form of white-collar crime in America.
Well, actually, in a way, he did. He did come on these speaking tours. He did give speaking tours in America in 1929 and 1931 and 32. And it was coming here on a speaking tour that he was so nearly killed on Fifth Avenue at 76th Street, where he was hit by a car. And you can see on the front here of this book you're all yearning to buy, of his a livid scar down the centre of his forehead there.
Oh, that's
which during meetings when he lost his temper in the War Cabinet, people said that the scar, which was created in December 1931 as a result of this terrible accident, used to go bright red in the middle of his forehead.
Now, you mentioned already, hinted at one of the factors that led him to be able to see far more clearly and much earlier what the Germans and Hitler could become. Were there other factors beyond having seen these essentially extremists?
Yes. Oh, definitely they were. Well, the key one, in my view, was his philo-Semitism. An awful lot of people from upper-class Britain in those days were anti-Semitic. Churchill, on the other hand, loved Jews. He grew up with Jews. He went on holiday with Jews. His father liked Jews. He believed that Jews gave the ethics for Western civilization. And so he had an early warning system which was, with regard to Hitler and the Nazis, which was denied to many other conservative MPs of the time. That's one thing. And the other thing, of course, is that he was an historian. One of the reasons I'm proud to be an historian is because Winston Churchill was one. It was his 4-volume life of his great ancestor John Churchill, first Duke of Marlborough, who of course had defeated Louis XIV's hegemonistic ambitions in the War of Spanish Succession, that allowed Churchill to put Hitler in the broad continuum, the broad sweep of European history. So you have Philip II of Spain being defeated and the Armada, Louis XIV being defeated by his great ancestor, then Napoleon, then Kaiser, and then Hitler. And so when you put those three together, the Nazis' persecution of the Jews, his own historical sensibility, and the fact that he'd seen fanaticism up close in the Northwest Frontier and the Sudan, he was able to be the first British politician, and in many ways the only British politician of any stature, to warn against Hitler in the 1930s.
Looking at him now as an individual, well known, obviously, that he had what I think he termed the Black Dog days, these periods of, extended periods of depression, and then also this prodigious capacity to drink alcohol.
Yeah.
Was he
I mean, did he have serious depression issues?
No, no.
And was he an alcoholic?
No. Very interestingly, this was one of the things that struck me most strongly. I had always assumed that Anthony Storr's 1968 article about Churchill's black dog was the last word on the matter. But actually, when you look at it, he only mentions black dog once in his whole life, and that's in a letter to his wife Clementine in July 1911. And that was at a time when the phrase black dog actually was used by Edwardian matrons and governesses to talk about their bad-tempered children. He did get depressed, undoubtedly. He considered suicide at one point in the Dardanelles, during the Dardanelles catastrophe. But the times when he got depressed, and other times, of course, were during February and June 1942, when he had the disasters at Singapore and at
North Africa?
Yes, in North Africa, where we lost a city in North Africa. Those are the points where he got depressed, and it was a very and anyone would have got depressed under those circumstances. But depression, as you know, is a deeply debilitating illness, and the idea that he could, which can strike at any time, the idea that he could have chaired 1,000 meetings of the Defence Committee of the War Cabinet at any time of the day or night is, I think, is evidence of the fact, as most medical writers now, modern ones now, attest, that he was not a depressive, he wasn't manic depressive, and he certainly wasn't bipolar, which I've seen some historians claim. As far as his drinking was concerned, he did drink an enormous amount. C.P. Scott said that Winston Churchill couldn't have been an alcoholic because no alcoholic could have drunk that much. And when you see how much he drank, but nonetheless, he had the constitution of an ox. And he was, I agree with him when he said that he had taken more out of alcohol than alcohol had taken out of him. And when you look at it, the Second World War was 2,174 days long. There is only one occasion, one of those nights, that people around him noticed that he was drunk. And they basically just ignored, the next day, they just ignored the decisions that had been taken at that meeting.
I assume he didn't ever decide to test the proposition and go one night without any alcohol?
No, not that. Oh, no, actually, sorry, there's one point where he writes to his wife. You remember how I said how he was constantly broke? He writes to Clementine saying, we must have no more champagne at Chartwell. We're not going to give guests champagne. That lasted 3 days.
Yeah, we talked a little bit earlier that he was incredibly intrepid as a soldier, as a journalist too. I mean, in some of his episodes or escapades in Africa, it's not clear whether he was a soldier or a journalist, something you couldn't quite get away with these days, to put it mildly. What about this physical courage and near-death experiences? Did they have any impact on him that becomes relevant as he goes along?
That's a good question. It was absolutely central to this idea that he was being specially protected by the Almighty. He believed that all of these close brushes with death, I'll just run through a few of the more famous ones, but together he believed that they meant that the Almighty was taking care of him. In fact, when you look theologically into it, the only major duty of the Almighty in Churchill's theology was to take care of Winston Churchill. He was born 2 months premature. He was stabbed in the stomach by a penknife when he was 10 years old. He had very bad pneumonia when he was 11 and nearly died. The doctors on that occasion administered brandy to him, both orally and rectally. You'd have thought that would have put you off brandy for life, don't you, David? But nonetheless, it certainly didn't in his case. Then he nearly drowned in Lake Geneva. He was saved from a house fire which burnt down a house he was sleeping in. He, of course, took part in all those attacks we mentioned earlier, and that nearly killed him as well, the time on Fifth Avenue. he also had two plane crashes and 3 car crashes. And he complained to his wife that no insurance company would give him life assurance.
Not as well known, I don't think, is his affair, well, out of government in the 1930s with this glamorous aristocrat, Doris, the Viscountess Castleton. How do you deal with that in your biography?
I point out it's completely untrue.
Really?
Completely untrue. There is no evidence for it whatsoever. I actually found the evidence that the 2 authors who've made such a thing of it before them, and the more I looked at it, the more I realised that this was not an affair at all. It was a perfectly reasonable friendship. There is no indication that he broke his marriage vows. So it's summed up. I give the reader,
Yep.
if the reader wants to take a different impression, fine. I give them all the evidence, but it's basically pretty much dismissed in a couple of pages.
Westminster College, I'm sure you've been out there to the Churchill
Yes,
Museum. It's a fabulous spot,
Yes,
by
exactly.
the way, for those of you. It's actually, in fact, the museum, as I recall, is actually built underneath an old chapel that was actually taken, or a cathedral that's
St.
taken
Mary's,
brick by
Aldebury.
brick.
Yeah, which was blitzed.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah, and reconstructed out there. Really a magical spot. I remember one of the displays in that museum that struck me, it stayed with me most, is it's a flip-flop device. So this is not digital, but it goes back and forth because he flip-flopped between parties.
Oh, I see.
And,
yes.
and it's quite remarkable. I mean, nowadays, if you flip-flop, with maybe one major exception that I can think of, but you'd be finished.
Yeah.
And yet, he
I know,
managed
yes.
to do this.
Yes, he left the Conservative Party over the issue of free trade in 1904 because he was a free trader. But when the Conservative Party went back to free trade in 1924, he went back to the Conservative Party. As he put it, quite a number of people have ratted, but very few have successfully re-ratted.
Now, how would you characterize Churchill? I mean, people are always saying, well, this guy is lucky, or he's good, or he's well prepared, or where would you come down on that with him?
I think his foresight is remarkable, not just with the Nazis, but also, of course, after the Second World War with the Soviet Union and Stalin, warning about the new Cold War. I think his ability to learn from his mistakes was crucial as well. He learnt from Gallipoli in that he never overruled the chiefs of staff at any stage of the Second World War, which you all appreciate, I would have thought, General, yeah. He was somebody who, of course, showed tremendous physical courage, as we've mentioned, and certainly during the Second World War when he flew 110,000 miles outside the United Kingdom. He was the glue that kept the big three together. And also tremendous moral courage, of course, during the 1930s in not adapting his message about Hitler and the Nazis to the prevailing opinion, which was that he was a mad warmonger and should shut up. So you have, and that was partly his aristocratic background, because Victorian aristocrats very much thought that it was dishonourable to change your opinion just because a focus group or an opinion poll says that you ought to. So he really managed to bring together, therefore, all of the positive things about a politician. However, it's very important to remember that he also had made tremendous mistakes all the way through his life. He had got women's suffrage wrong, he'd got the gold standard wrong, he'd got the abdication crisis wrong, he'd got the Irish policy wrong, and primarily, of course, the Dardanelles wrong. So this is a man who made mistakes, who was a genius, but he was a flawed genius.
So what do you think will surprise readers most about your biography of Churchill?
I think they'll be mostly surprised by the way in which Churchill used the king almost as a shrink, basically, to complain about, especially in 1940 and 1941, the lack of American interest in entering the war. He saw the Second World War as a war for civilization and democracy. He couldn't understand why the United States wasn't getting further into the struggle, and that ultimately it took Adolf Hitler to declare war against America in December 1941. So that will be something. I think there are sort of waspish comments about the Roosevelt administration, which I think will surprise American readers at least.
Interesting. One of the audience asks that you talk a bit about Clementine and Winston's relationship, his wife.
Yes, good question. She was tremendously important to him. He didn't vouchsafe strategic or military secrets to her, but he did talk to her about politics. She was actually a liberal. She didn't rejoin the Conservative. She didn't join the Conservative Party ever, actually. She was a liberal all the way through her life. And she gave him very good advice at the time of the Dardanelles, which was to stay in the trenches and to continue fighting. And it was advice which pained her terribly to give, because obviously he was taking these risks, and she knew that. But she knew that he wasn't going to be able to enjoy life if he came back too early and therefore hadn't done the honourable thing in the trenches. And then later in June 1940, she writes to him a splendidly, she was a great aristocratic battle axe, basically. And she writes this letter to him about how he must stop being beastly to the staff. He was short-tempered to his secretaries and bad-tempered to his private secretaries, and he's got to buck himself up, and that nobody else can tell him this apart from the king.
And she writes this to him.
She writes this to him in a letter. It's the only letter we have from either of them for 1940, because they lived together. But she didn't want to just sort of tell him because she thought it would sound stronger on paper. She apparently ripped up the first 3 drafts of this letter, but she gave it to him, and it worked, and he was better natured for probably about 24 hours.
I was just going to ask the duration of that, but when and by what means did Churchill first publicly speak out against or decry in writing Adolf Hitler?
Speak out against Adolf Hitler?
Yes.
Gosh, I ought to be able to know the exact date, but it was soon after Hitler became Chancellor. Hitler became Chancellor in January 1933.
Right.
I think the first criticisms come in 1934.
That early?
Well, you see, Hitler, of course, wasn't a major international figure until the 1932
Yes,
election.
of course. What do you hope readers will take from your book?
Connie, I think they ought to take a sense of this extraordinary man's eccentricities. I mean, he was just so strange. He was a very, very weird person, and in a completely adorable way. I also think that there is a sort of redemptive story here, because he did make terrible mistakes, but nonetheless he learned from them, and he managed to get on as a result. So in that sense, it's a very American story, really. It's the second chance in life that he grasped. I think that I give easily enough evidence for people who don't like Churchill to appreciate that he was very, very difficult to work with or work under, let alone be the boss of. But I think ultimately people should really take from this the idea that 16-year-old schoolboy who said he was going to save London and the country and the empire, actually, because of this hard work and these virtues and these extraordinary struggles and these risks that he took, managed to save all 3 of those things also, but civilization itself ultimately.
Can you talk about Churchill's relationship with Louis Mountbatten?
Yes, he liked and admired Louis Mountbatten. He didn't like the way that Mountbatten partitioned India. He thought that led to unnecessary massacres on the northwest frontier and the Punjab. But otherwise, he appointed Mountbatten to pretty much every single role he had, short of Viceroy.
How would Churchill do in politics today given the increasing populism, partisanship, an era where so many citizens get their information from social media.
Yes. I think he'd have been brilliant on Twitter. No, seriously, he would have. He would have, because so many of his witticisms and his gags and his aperçus couldn't fit into 280 characters. There was a marvellous moment where, his put-downs for hecklers were very, very quick as well. You know, there was a heckler in one of his speeches who shouted "rot," and Churchill immediately replied, "Thank you for telling me what's on your mind."
Speaking of Churchill quotes, many of us, and I'm among them, are inveterate users of his quotes to respond to any challenge at all, including contemporary times. As an example, I was in Singapore a month or so ago for the Temasek Summit, and I was asked, can we still count on America to do the right thing? And I thankfully recalled and repeated Churchill's observation that you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after all the other things. When asked about the current shortcomings exhibited by many of the world's democracies, including America's, I recall Churchill's observation that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. What are your favorite quotes from this great man?
Well, I love the one what he said to a young man an American student actually, who happened to be at the coronation luncheon when Her Majesty the Queen was crowned in 1953, and he said to this young man, study history, for therein lies all these lessons of statecraft," which I think is wonderful. But there's another one on page 616 of this, which he used at the funeral oration for Neville Chamberlain. And of course, he'd opposed Neville Chamberlain aggressively and in the most tough way, and Neville Chamberlain had kept him out of his governments for as long as he could until the actual war had started, and then brought him in. And then after that, they worked very closely together, and they worked very well together. And Churchill said this about history, and I still think it's the best summation in a sentence of my craft. "History, with its flickering lamp, stumbles along the trail of the past, trying to reconstruct its scenes, to revive its echoes, and kindle with pale gleams the passion of former days."
Lovely.
It's great, isn't it?
You'd be proud to write that.
Oh, can you imagine?
If you were sharing brandy in Monte Cristo, which I assume is a cigar, with Churchill, what two questions would you like to ask him?
The first question I'd like to ask him is, why did you worship your father so much, considering how he treated you? He, after this abrasive figure had denounced him and wrote these horrible letters to him, Churchill, when his father died, when Lord Randolph Churchill died in 1895, when he was 45 and Winston Churchill was 20, Churchill then wrote a 2-volume biography of his father, a very hagiographical one, frankly, sought out all his father's friends to talk to them about his father, named his own son Randolph, adopted his father's Tory Democrat policies that came down from Benjamin Disraeli, his political stance, adopted his physical stance of standing with his hand on his hip, with his hand pointing down. And as soon as he made any money, which, as I said, was in his 70s, he spent it in that classic Regency way on the first of 37 racehorses, and he put the jockeys in his father's racing colours. And then in 1947, he wrote a short story about how he had seen and met his father's ghost. It's a very strange, psychologically, there's a lot going on here. He met his father's ghost, and his father, at no point, and they have a conversation about politics and world events and what's happened. Actually, one of the things he says is Britain, the father says, is Britain still the greatest power in the world? He said, no, America is now, but it doesn't matter because they're our cousins and we get on with them. And then he sort of wafts away, the ghost, And at no stage did Churchill tell his father that he'd actually been instrumental in helping win the Second World War. So you can see Churchill's life as being a struggle to win the admiration of his dead father.
By the way, wonderful questions from the audience tonight.
Yeah, very
Thank
high
you.
quality questions.
This one, Attlee seems a perfect foil and friend to Churchill. Can you describe their complicated friendship and rivalry?
Yes. Clement Attlee, the leader of the Labour Party, was a tremendous patriot. He supported Churchill wonderfully in the key moments in May 1940, both over the creation of the national government in that month and also over the attempts to have peace negotiations with Hitler. And he admired that and was thankful for it. However, of course, they were both leaders of the opposite parties, and it was Attlee who trounced Churchill in the general election of July 1945.
45, so just within months, less than a month. Of the end
Within 2 months of the end of the war, exactly. Actually, whilst they were at the Potsdam Conference, conferring with Stalin and FDR.
Thank you for your service, Prime Minister.
Yes, exactly. Amazing. But he then, so of course he, in public, lambasted Attlee's policies, and he very much did oppose lots of Attlee's policies. But nonetheless, personally, he would never allow any criticism of Attlee at Chartwell or in his house in London, because he liked him so much.
What was Churchill's relationship with and view of the media, and how actively did he seek to control government communication?
Well, of course, as a journalist, he was very interested in the media. He used to have the newspapers delivered to him every day, as soon as they came off the presses, so he could see what they were saying. He was very friendly with the newspaper barons, Lords Beaverbrook and Rothermere and Northcliffe and the others. He wrote an enormous amount for newspapers. In fact, there's a marvellous moment. Sometimes in the 1930s, he'd write an article and the editor wouldn't want it. So he'd put it away in the drawer, like most journalists do, and wait until better times came round. When in the Second World War, he was also short of cash during the Second World War. He would bring out old articles that had been turned down, knowing perfectly well that any editor in London would publish anything the Prime Minister was writing. So he'd be able to cash in on it. So there's a moment on the 7th of March 1942, where there's an article in the Sunday Dispatch, and this, by the way, is a terrible time for the Allies. The Japanese have taken 1/8 of the planet. The Russians are still massively on the retreat in Ukraine. Our attacks on the northwest littoral have run into the sand. I think you're doing pretty terrible things are happening on the Bataan Peninsula and the rest in the Philippines. And this is the moment that the British Prime Minister publishes an article entitled, "Are There Men on the Moon?" and concludes that there probably were men on the moon, and there were definitely aliens and UFOs. And I like to think, what on earth would anyone do if Theresa May was to publish an article in one of the Sunday Times paper, asking whether they were saying that there were men on the moon?
Here's a great one. Can you discuss your approach to research? So you had all these news sources, these new documents in Cambridge. Do you work with a team to sift through them, or do you work through all of them yourself?
I've never once employed a research assistant for any book that I've written at all, and I never would, because I'm terrified that they might be lazy and therefore take down precisely verbatim what they read, and therefore I would then do the same thing, and I'd wind up being accused of plagiarism. So I've made it an absolute iron rule never to use a research assistant, which of course does mean that my Napoleon book took 7 years to write, which is longer, by the way, than Napoleon spent on St. Helena and Elba put together. But nonetheless, that's the way I approach it.
In all of your research, which moment of Churchill's life is the most powerful and defines his character the best?
Wow, that's another great question. I think it's the 14th of June 1940, his visit to the prefecture at Tours. He flew out there. He was desperate. It was the same day that the Germans captured Paris, and he was desperately trying to keep the Reynaud government, the French government, in the war. And Marshal Pétain and General Weygand had refused to take part in the meeting. But nonetheless, he flew out there with a small squadron of Spitfires to protect him, because they were well within Luftwaffe radius. And they landed at Tours, and there was no reception committee to meet them. And so they found a couple of French Air Force officers, and who hadn't had lunch, and they all piled into these two cars with Lord Beaverbrook sitting on Churchill's bodyguard's lap. They drove into Tours, past these long lines of refugees, who, many of them with the windows of their cars machine gunned by Germans who were trying to block the roads. And they drove into Tours and had lunch at the prefecture, and had this meeting with Reynaud, who begged them to allow France to make peace with Germany, and therefore break the agreement that they'd made that March, that there'd be no separate peace. And Churchill said no, and he said that he would do everything to ensure that France wouldn't fall. He would send Canadian divisions and British divisions to Brittany to try and have a Brittany redoubt, and there were more troops coming over from Australia and India and so on. But it was clear that the French had absolutely no intention of trying to fight on. And Reynaud then said, in that case, as we're about to capitulate, if you capitulate too, we're going to be able to get much better terms from the Führer. And Churchill gave what Lord Beaverbrook, who was present, said was the greatest speech of his career, but it was only given in a group of some 15 people. Oh, and by the way, just to make the whole thing even more dramatic, Paul Reynaud's, the French Prime Minister's mistress, the Comtesse de Port, who hated Churchill and was pro-Nazi, kept trying to scratch his face, kept trying to break into the meeting and attack Churchill, and she had to be physically taken out by a naval attaché that was and the whole thing must have been. I'd love to see a cinematic reconstruction of that thing, maybe with Gary Oldman. You know, it would be just fantastic fun. And so and Churchill said no. He said, we will fight on. We will survive. We will get through this. If we are invaded, we will fight back. I've given the order. If the Germans paratroops land, I'm going to tell the British people on the radio, the time has come. Kill the Hun. And he said, and eventually we will not only save ourselves, we should also save you. But if you allow your fleet to fall into the Germans' hands, you will be excoriated by 1,000 years of history. And apparently it was, the situation was just electric. And I think that's one of the moments that I'm proudest of this man.
Wonderful. Two last ones. First, from the audience, how do you compare your view of Churchill with that of Martin Gilbert?
Well, I loved Martin Gilbert. He's a great man. The only way that any Churchill biographer can write about Churchill is through standing on the shoulders of a giant. And in this case, in Churchill historiography, it's Martin Gilbert, a truly gigantic figure in our world, and the author, of course, of the 8-volume biography of Churchill. In terms of ideology and things like that, I don't think Martin and I disagree on very much, actually. He was very interested in pretty much all of the things that I'm interested in. I think maybe I'm a little bit more interested in the military side of things. And of course there were certain things like the King's Diaries that Martin didn't have access to, and those other things that I mentioned that have come out in the last 10 years since his very sad and tragic and unnecessary death.
Well, finally, Churchill did have an exceedingly sharp, deft, and quick wit. And so perhaps we could close this evening with your favorite Churchill joke or jokes.
Yeah, there's a marvellous one where his private secretary came in and said that their cook had been... You should never laugh at your own punchline before you make it. No. Their cook had been made pregnant as the result of a nocturnal assignation with a man in the street in Verona. And Churchill replied immediately, "Obviously not one of the two gentlemen."
Ladies and gentlemen, I think you can see why I was so pleased and delighted that we could have Andrew Roberts on the stage tonight to talk about his great new book.